If you've ever watched a spy film, you've probably seen the moment. A hidden radio crackling in the dark. A coded notebook slipped into a pocket. A passport that isn't quite real. These objects feel cinematic, almost mythical. But in reality, the tools of espionage were often much smaller and much quieter. In the first 2 episodes of this series, we talked about the people behind wartime intelligence. Women whose lives read like novels, like Virginia Hall and Noor Inayat Khan, and the thousands of others whose work remained invisible inside intelligence networks. Today, I want to step even closer to the story. Not to the people this time, but to the objects they relied on. Because the radios, code books, aliases, and safe houses weren't just props of espionage, they were survival. When films portray espionage, the focus is usually on dramatic action, chases, explosions, daring escapes. But most intelligence work in the 1940s depended on something far less dramatic: precision. Tiny mistakes could expose an entire network. A mistyped radio transmission, a misplaced document, a pattern noticed by the wrong person. So the tools of espionage were designed for one purpose above all else: to disappear. One of the most dangerous tools an agent could carry was a wireless radio. In the first episode of this series, we talked about agents like Noor Inayat Khan, women who relied on radio transmissions to keep intelligence networks alive. Those transmissions often came from equipment small enough to hide in a suitcase. These portable transmitters allowed resistance agents to communicate with London from inside occupied territory. But the radios were fragile, heavy, and incredibly dangerous to use. German counterintelligence teams were constantly scanning the airwaves. The longer a transmission lasted, the easier it was to trace. Wireless operators were taught to send their messages in under 20 minutes. Some sent them in 10. And every time they switched the radio on, they knew they were likely revealing their location. Historians estimate that wireless operators had some of the shortest survival rates in wartime intelligence, and yet they continued transmitting. Another essential tool was the codebook. These small notebooks transformed ordinary words into encrypted messages. A simple sentence like, "The shipment arrives tomorrow," might be transmitted as a string of numbers or seemingly unrelated words. The purpose was simple. Even if the message were intercepted, it would be meaningless without the key. Some codes changed daily. Others required complex systems of substitution. And codebooks themselves were dangerous objects. If captured, they could reveal entire networks. Many agents carried instructions to destroy their codebooks immediately if the threat of capture was before them, which meant that sometimes the most valuable intelligence tools existed only briefly, long enough to send a message and then disappear. And often the people responsible for protecting those tools were the same quiet clerks, translators, and codebreakers whose work we talked about in the last episode. The invisible labor behind intelligence work extended far beyond the front lines. Another tool of espionage was something less tangible: a name. Agents often operated under carefully constructed aliases: false passports, forged identity papers, invented biographies. But maintaining an alias required far more than simply carrying the right documents. It meant remembering every detail: where you were supposedly born, where you worked, who might recognize you. One hesitation, one forgotten fact, one slip in accent or language, and the illusion could collapse. The alias wasn't just paperwork. It was a performance that never stopped. Espionage stories often highlight secret locations, but in reality, safe houses were rarely dramatic. They were apartments, farmhouses, small city flats, places where an agent might sleep for a night before moving again. Sometimes the people who hosted these locations were part of resistance networks. Sometimes they were ordinary citizens taking enormous risks. A safe house might store radios, documents, or messages waiting to be carried forward. And if discovered, everyone connected with it would be in danger. Which meant that secrecy extended far beyond the agents themselves. Entire communities sometimes lived with the quiet knowledge that something important was happening behind an ordinary door. Spy films tend to emphasize spectacle, but the real history of wartime intelligence was often defined by restraint. Messages sent quickly and quietly, documents hidden in plain sight, objects small enough to slip into a pocket. Historians studying resistance networks, including research preserved in archives such as the Imperial War Museum and the Bletchley Park Trust, often describe espionage as a discipline of patience. What films sometimes miss is the waiting. Hours waiting for the right moment to transmit a message. Days traveling under a false identity without drawing any attention. Weeks relying on objects that might save your life or expose it. For writers of historical fiction, these small details matter enormously because objects carry story. A radio isn't just equipment, it's tension. A codebook isn't just paper, it's the fragile thread connecting people across occupied territory. An alias isn't just a false name, it's the emotional strain of living between identities. And when historical fiction includes these realities, the story becomes more believable. Not because it's louder or more dramatic, but because it's grounded in truth. When we look back at wartime espionage, it's tempting to focus on the extraordinary moments, but many of the most important acts of courage happened quietly. Turning on a radio, memorizing a code, answering to a name that wasn't your own. The tools of espionage were simple, but the people who used them carried enormous responsibility. Across this three-part series, we've looked at the lives of real spies, the invisible women behind intelligence networks, and the objects that made their work possible. Taken together, these stories remind us of something important. History is rarely shaped by dramatic moments alone. More often, it moves forward through quiet decisions. A message transmitted, a document hidden, a door opened to someone in danger. And sometimes through the smallest tools held in steady hands. Tools that allow extraordinary courage to remain almost entirely unseen. In the next Author Notes Historical Deep Dive, we'll explore another side of this question, the real historical events that inspire the historical novels we love. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, happy reading. When films portray espionage, the focus is usually on dramatic action, chases, explosions, daring escapes. But most intelligence work in the 1940s depended on something far less dramatic. Precision. Well, we might not be able to edit out the ambulance going by.